So we've come to the final end note. It's a huge pleasure to be able to introduce Alison Kennedy. She doesn't really need any introduction to this audience, but I'm going to give one anyway. So yesterday, we heard a lot about ChatGPT and LLMs being unreliable, so I went old school and just did a search on Wikipedia. So according to Wikipedia, Alison Kennedy is a Scots writer, academic and stand-up comedian who writes novels, stories and non-fiction.
That's my alternative. We're so
as many of you know, Alison was the director of the Hartree Centre for several years. She was the co-founder of Women in HPC. She this year was identified by HPC Wire as one of their 35 legends of the last of the century, I think. Yeah. So,
Ian Seymour Crane.
Yep. So, and according to LinkedIn, it says her profile says she's retired from permanent employment but still active on a range of projects and committees. Given how many things I'm involved in that Alison is involved in, she's extremely active and continuing to play a really valuable role across many, many parts of our community. So it's a huge pleasure to introduce Alison. I'll hand over to her.
Thanks. So, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for staying to the bitter end. So, as Mark said, I'm now an independent person. I've had a range of roles. Anything I say that's controversial, I'm not expecting there to be anything controversial, but it's me that's saying it, and it's no longer STFC or UKRI. I've also got a bit more time to read now, so I look through news stories. So apologies if this presentation comes over as a bit of, stream of consciousness, but that's what happens when you get old. Okay, so in different circumstances, I would have hoped to be here talking to you about Pathway to Exascale, the technical procurement group and the work we're doing there. But as you'll all know, we're on a pause. So while we wait for the next stage, one of the things that we're looking to do is to solidify where we are so that when the government does allow us to go ahead, we can move ahead at speed. But part of that means what can we learn from the past? What can we do differently in future? How can we avoid making the same mistakes on a bigger scale where we have more money for a bigger computer, more money to expand our community, we've got to sell it to government, we've got to sell it to a much bigger science community, we've got to sell it to the general public. So hopefully this talk will pick up some of the things that have come up elsewhere over the past couple of days. So the tagline here is, our ability to reach unity and diversity will be the beauty and test of our civilization. So partly to establish my diversity credentials, my first undergraduate degree is in history. Does anybody know where this quote comes from and in what context? No? It's Mahatma Gandhi, Indian lawyer who brought about independence in India, led a successful campaign, and I'd like to think that one of the lessons we learned from that in the UK is if we all come together, we have some chance of supporting science, moving forward, bringing real benefits to the UK. I also like the non-violent. I think we're a non-violent community. Okay, so a machine learning algorithm walks into a bar and the bartender says, "What are you having?" And the machine learning algorithm says, "What's everybody else having?" So I think without pushing the analogy too far, one of the problems we have in the UK at the moment is we're quite isolated communities. So if you were to talk to DRAC community, they'd have quite clear ideas about what they wanted to get from a program. EPSAC might have different ideas. If you spoke to the other communities, they would have different ideas. So I think it's very important to us to establish requirements by talking to a whole range of communities. Similarly, in a bar like this, it would probably be cocktails and posh beers. If it was spit and sawdust, it would be pints of heavy and whiskey chasers or whatever. So just to get you thinking about that. Second one, jumping off bridges. A parent says, if all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you? The child, of course, says no, but the machine learning algorithm says yes. So I think the point of this is, if you go online, it's easy to find lots of pictures that are tagged of people jumping off bridges, but pictures of people walking across bridges are not tagged as people not jumping off bridges. So be careful what you're looking for and what data you're collecting, and how you use it so you get the right sorts of answers. Okay, so to give an example about the importance of diverse data and diverse personnel, moving on slightly, this is an example from 2020, where a tool that was designed to create realistic high-resolution images of people from these pixelated photos turned a picture of Barack Obama into a picture of a white man. So lots of discussion there about, does it come from incomplete data? Does it come from short-sighted decisions about the algorithm in terms of what data to consider? But really, the question that we should be asking is, why didn't it occur to anybody to test the software on a wide variety of people? Now, for my previous life, I have examples of that. I used to work for NCR, where we tried to ship our first touchscreen terminal to a really important trade show, where I discovered at the last minute that apparently it only worked if you were an engineer who bit your nails. So if you're a woman or a person with normal nails, and they had to reconfigure it all. So that was an early example for me of the importance of testing. And I think Marion has the T-shirt there. Okay, this I thought was an interesting example of diversity of data and a plan to do something in a different way. So for those of you who play video games, apparently there are a couple of video games in particular that are based around football. I think FIFA 12 apparently had the first examples of women players. They had 1.4% of their football players were women, so they can claim that they've incorporated the women's game. But the people at EAFC decided that with a growing interest in women's football, they wanted to do it properly. And significantly, it was a team of women that looked into this. But it turned out to be much, much harder than they expected. They thought they'd be able to pick up the data, 20 years of data on men, no data on women, and they also had to reprogram all the motion capture because women play the game in a slightly different way from men. So I love this bit at the end. One of the really difficult issues we've had was finding information. I could go online, probably find Harry Kane's cousin's dog name, whereas in the women's game, you struggle for basic information on them. In the interest of fairness, I couldn't find Harry Kane's cousin's dog name. Harry Kane's cousin, Harry Kane's dog, not that connection, but maybe I'd have had to look a bit harder. So I think the story here is that if we really want to do things differently, if we want to be very inclusive, we have to collect better data for our models if we really want to cover the entire science space, the entire community space. I think, although there was a huge amount of disappointment in our community when Exascale was postponed, I think what we have to remember is that £1 billion is a lot of money. So that's roughly, I think, what it will take for us to buy a bigger machine, to fund a big software program, to run it for a number of years, and possibly to add in some tier 2s. So if you look at this, it's over a number of years. Healthcare expenditure, 283 billion in 2022, which was the last year for which I've got good figures, but that's a decline in real terms. Similarly with education, 116 billion. Again, it's a big fall in the percentage of the UK money that goes on it. So we need a really solid case, and we need to be clear that if we're asking the government to buy us a computer, we know how we're going to use it. We use it in an inclusive way. We use it for the benefit of the UK overall. Okay, I didn't know Peter was going to be speaking at this. I'm not going to talk about Peter's research. The point that I wanted to make here really is that it's all very well to have personalised medicine. It'll be absolutely great if it comes about. But in countries like the UK, we want to make the technology cheap enough so it's not just the preserve of a few people with private healthcare. I know the UK is going more down that route of private healthcare, but we want to make sure if we're going to develop things that are inclusive, they have to be there for the whole community. Okay, again, Gordon Bell Prize, something that the UK would love to have a credible entry based on science that was run in the UK. There are people who've been part of consortia who've been nominated for Gordon Bell. I think maybe Peter has been, but it's always on facilities elsewhere. Got this slide from Mark Parsons. I've never read any of these papers. I think the first thing, though, is that the majority of them are HPC and AI. They're not HPC or AI. And if you look at them, if we go straight through them, they're all about really important science, but it has economic and social benefits. So defects in alloys, nuclear reactor simulations, convection, turbulence, biomolecular simulations at a large scale, atmospheric modelling, and the real breakthrough paper that helped put COVID in its position and explain how things spread. So I think we want the capability, we want to have the ability to contribute and to do science like that in the UK, but to sell our vision to government, we have to link it to economic and social benefits. So I know it's very unpopular to say things like nobody's going to spend £1 billion so that particle physicists can do their work a little bit faster, but particle physicists will benefit, but you can't be the main use case for it. It has to be much wider than that. Okay, UKRI makes a lot of talks a lot about the importance of diversity. And the most recent publication they came out with was called Thriving on Diversity. It was accompanied by this nice picture, 3 men, 3 women, lots of ethnic variety. And yet when you looked into the report, what it came up with was, by any measure, any way you cut the data, any science area, any research council, large science award grants were dominated by old white men. So that's maybe not a surprise, but I think what the surprise for me was the UKRI response. Issues are deep and systematic. We'll provide regular updates and we'll look at the statistics on an ongoing basis. Well, that's not really good enough. I think if we want to do things differently, we have to be far more proactive in looking at how we do that, looking at how we select people to get awards, rather than just sitting back looking at statistics. So UKRI could do better. Okay, next I'm going to look at an example from the US Exascale computing project. I think a few people in the UK, I think Hartree had sort of 4 people involved in that. So basically it's an 8-year program, 2,800 collaborators. So really, really big. So what was interesting there was an assumption in the US that as they put in place a very large program and scaled up, that somehow magically diversity would increase. So they moved to lots of less conventional science areas and incorporated them, and yet still the breakdown of the people that were working in CSE remained largely homogenous. So that was a concern to them, and that's something again that I think we need to try and learn lessons from so we don't make the same mistake in the UK. There's been a lot of talk about how we're short of people. We need to be far more imaginative about how we grow the skills and how we grow the workplace. So some of their conclusions were quite interesting. So So what they came across was that CSEs are adept at speaking multiple languages and covering many domains. So I think that builds on what Paul Richmond was saying yesterday about generalists and specialists in the RSE area. So we have a bunch of people who are very technically diverse. So they can adapt to a lot of different types of projects. But how do we translate that ability of people to adapt from one technical area to another, to broadening the number of people involved in the community? So they were looking at, is there a fundamental difference between diverse individuals and diverse teams? And the answer was, yes, there probably is. So the recommendations for that is to pay much more attention to building teams. So rather than going out and saying, my mate over there that I've always worked with could probably work with me on this project because he's quite good at changing what he does, we have to look at what sort of new skills and potential new additions we can bring into teams, and then encourage these new groupings and new skills and build them into teams. So again, that takes more work than reaching out to your friends and saying, I've worked with you before, I'd like you to be in my team. But it is something we're going to have to do if we're serious about building a more diverse community and broadening the range of science that we do. The next piece of research I want to highlight was done by the EU Science Hub, and it's about diversity in AI conferences, and it's focusing particularly on researchers. So the finding there was that, unsurprisingly again, there was a very low proportion of female authors in AI conferences, and that really reflected the low presence of women in the AI field. But they did see that diversity efforts were slowly making an impact in the community. So I think Jenny talked about mentoring, networking, affinity groups like Women in HPC, having diversity and inclusion chairs. But interestingly, what they identified was the number of women on organising committees was growing much faster than the number of women authors. So you see this even from conferences like supercomputing, where they're very keen on having technical selection coming from a wide range of the community. They're very good at organising that, but it hasn't really brought about big changes in the composition of authors. So I think it's really up to individual departments and universities to think a lot more about whose names get put in papers, who gets recommended to go to conferences and talking about it. So I wouldn't want people to think that looking around saying we've got lots of women on committees, aren't we doing well in terms of diversity? Because that's a small part of it, but it's not really good enough. Okay, next some research from America about public perception of scientists. Comes from a well-respected research centre called the Annenberg Public Policy Centre. And worryingly, what they found is that in America, public perceptions of the credibility of scientists is dropping quite fast. So it's eroded between 2023 and 2024. And even more worryingly, public perception of scientists working in artificial intelligence differs from those of scientists as a whole. And would you like to guess whether it's higher or lower? It's lower. Okay, so the main findings there is that far fewer people felt that scientists benefited the country as a whole or benefited people like them. So it had gone down, as I say, quite significantly in a year. And I think if we are looking to sell to the UK government that whatever we buy is going to be value for society, we need to get society on our side. A bunch of us saying, oh, it's a real shame you cut our Exascale program will make some impact, but we really need to engage with a much wider community so that people understand what the benefits are going to be. So I think this is the States. So they did identify a couple of factors, attacks on climate science and on COVID-related science, as well as concerns about the rapid deployment of AI. So we're not yet at the stage where people are blaming the Labour government for bad weather in the way that people are blaming the Democrats in the States. But I think we have moved into an era where we have the likes of GB News presenting an agenda. We have whatever Twitter's called nowadays. We have BBC being very careful about bias. So whenever somebody presents one view, they have to bring in somebody else with an alternative view. So there are huge numbers of conflicting news sources, and we have to be aware of that and think about how we phrase our arguments. So yeah, only 42% thought that scientists were able to overcome human and political biases, and only 21% thinking that about AI scientists. Quite worrying. Okay, next piece of research, again, comes from the artificial intelligence community. Gender-specific differences in perception, understanding, and training interest. So what this study was looking at was, why are women underrepresented in the emerging AI professions? How is this hampering the innovation potential of countries? And what can we do about that? Because we don't have this breadth of perspectives. So one of the things they came out with, and this will not be a surprise to most women, men tend to view AI applications more positively, to rate their own competencies higher, and have more trust in the technology than women. So women perhaps are a bit more cautious about getting involved or putting themselves forward as experts, whereas men are right in there. So what does this tell us about the way that we perhaps need to train people, and so that we can encourage more women into the field? So if we look in a bit more detail at the findings, women were much more keen on knowledge. They wanted, and I think again this squares with something somebody else was talking about in terms of the learning. Women want good examples. They want to have debate about where AI is going. They want better communication about advantages and disadvantages, and they want democratic and transparent decision-making processes. All these things are within our gift. We just need to change the way we do things, be a bit more open. I know a number of us are involved in training initiatives, so just think, how do we change our training rather than trying to get as many people as possible through so that we can grow the community who are available to take jobs? Can we think a bit more carefully about what we need to do to encourage people and make them confident about coming into our area, joining our community? So the final conclusion from this paper was that the early involvement of women in the development of AI applications and the establishment of clear rules would help to ensure gender equality in the workplace. Okay, next I thought I'd go on to talk a little bit about the idea of men's work and women's work. So I first began to think about this. I think DIRAC did a survey about 8 years ago. I think it was Jeremy and Claire looked into jobs inside DIRAC and whether there was a difference between the roles which men and women did. And their research then suggested that men were more confident about being programmers. Women tended to take the roles of running the jobs, collecting the data, writing up, but that men were much more likely to get their names on the papers. But I found this about ENIAC, first programmable digital computer in the 1940s. So the first statement there, programming requires lots of patience, persistence, and a capacity for detail, and these are traits that many girls have. Well, so far, so good. I think we'd all agree with that. But if you look at what actually happened in the 1940s, women couldn't be promoted into professional ratings. Designing hardware was men's work because that was difficult. Programming the software was women's work because that was quite easy. So that's a perception. Okay, we're talking 1940s, a long time ago, but we're talking about, perceptions do change over time. So again, it's within our gift to change these perceptions in terms of the way that we present things. So next I'm going to give you a book recommendation. I'm sorry, I couldn't really help myself. So this is a book that I read recently. It's set in the 1960s. It's about a woman chemist who's working it's fiction. It's a woman chemist who's working in a research establishment which doesn't take women seriously and has all sorts of discriminatory policies. She gets forced out. She takes a job on a cooking show where her mission is to teach chemistry via cooking to broaden the minds and the horizons of women. So that's quite an interesting one because it gives you, it's a good book, but it gives you an insight into working life for women in science in the 1960s. Okay, however, no matter how much progress we think we've made, things like this are still happening. So August 24, largest cybersecurity company in the US, goes to a big trade show in Las Vegas and has two women with lampshades on their heads to draw attention to their collaborative happy hour. So lots of backlash, which apparently surprised them. So the point here, I think, is we now have a social responsibility charter for procurement in UKRI. So if you come up with something like this, vendors, you won't be funded. I'm not suggesting anyone would, but at least we now take into consideration in our procurement not just the technical ideas, the idea of, are you a socially responsible company and what are you doing about it? Next, I was going to go on to say a little bit about the hidden ref, which I think Paul Richmond mentioned. So I think everybody who works in a university will be familiar with the ref. It's the way the UK system assesses excellence of research in higher education. But alternatively, from the last ref, there was this hidden ref competition that was looking to draw attention to the importance of non-traditional roles, while people are focused on the ref to open up consideration of all the roles in research. So again, initiatives like this are important in opening people's eyes to how important it is to have a broad range of roles and a broad range of people working across the community. So yeah, many people work in roles that are vital to research but are unrecognised by traditional academic and research organisations. So from RSEs down to a whole lot of other roles. And now I'm going to give you one of my personal opinions. I think it's really good that there's been a growth in the number of professors and people who had previously been professional services moving into academic roles in universities. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. I don't want universities to think, we've made so-and-so a professor and the other 90 people who work in that group can be professional services. There has to be a career path that recognises that everybody is important. So it's good to have a few professors because they can then make the case for the importance of all the research roles that go on in a university. But it's necessary, but it's not sufficient to have a few professors. So I think this is an ongoing activity. It's being started up, I think, for the next ref. A number of people, I think, are contributing, writing in, saying my role's important and this is why. So the idea is that there are still many specialists and experts working in research who are under-recognised. So again, in terms of building the community, it's important that we tackle this, that we recognise it, and we give these people credit. To try and build a complete picture of what we need to do to have a successful and inclusive research community. I also had a look at Chris Whitty's evidence to the COVID inquiry. I think most people who've worked in HPC and AI have been involved in or at least know about projects where high-performance computing or AI played an important role in the UK's response to COVID. A lot of our computers, a lot of our people worked on projects in that area. And I think we need to be able to capitalize on that, to build on that. So one of the things that Chris Whitty said was it's really important to have the mechanism to be able to do research very, very fast. And one of the ways we can do that is by access to state-of-the-art digital infrastructure, computers, people, when we need to do that. And I think the other interesting thing is people underestimate that it's actually the science that's going to get them out the hole, not the other things. And the other things are holding the line until the science works. So computational science, AI, really important. We need to build on that and push forward with that, to use that as part of making the case for investment. I also thought this was an interesting story. So OpenAI planning to become a for-profit company. So this is a story that broke in The Guardian in September this year. I think there's been a bit of discussion at this meeting about the amount of research that's going on in the private sector compared to the public sector. Yes, that's absolutely true. But I thought it was interesting, OpenAI heading for a loss of as much as 5 billion this year. So under lots of pressure to make profits. So the idea there is if you can invite in to raise a significant amount of money from investors and removing restrictions on profits, that's an extra incentive for backers to come in and support you. So while there undoubtedly will be benefits in companies like OpenAI coming up with newer and better products, we have to think about, is this going to lessen their commitment to social and public good? So within our academic and national lab sector, we are committed to social and public good. So how do we balance these two things? And I think as Peter said in one of the panels, tech sector is led by a few very large companies. It's racing towards developing these really powerful tools, and there must be concerns that safety and considerations of equality, diversity, accuracy will be taking a back seat. So this is my last slide. Just like to draw some conclusions, and what I've done here is I'm using the words of two respected organisations and movements in the UK. So the first of them is Tech UK, which is the trade body for many of the tech companies in the UK. Algorithmic decision making is only as good as the data set it's trained on. It's crucial to train AI systems on diverse data sets that reflect the diversity of the population to avoid perpetuating skewed or discriminatory outcomes. And they also went on to say it's essential to ensure that the teams developing AI systems are diverse and inclusive, so that we have the technology designed with different perspectives, experiences, and cultural backgrounds in mind. So that's a respected body, which I think will also be engaging with the university, with the government. So we should also be, I think, talking to bodies like that where we're making our case. And the other one I wanted to highlight is Move the Needle, which is an initiative which has largely grown out of women in HPC, which now has an additional programme. Despite the growing recognition of diversity's value, achieving genuine inclusivity in high-performance computing remains a significant challenge. So various studies, conferences and surveys highlight the ongoing struggle, underscoring the urgency to address these issues. Creating an inclusive space for individuals is not just a moral obligation, it's essential for driving the innovation and creativity that powers the HPC industry. So I think I'm going to finish with a call to the community. This is not something that somebody else does for us. It's something that we all have to work on together. If we really care about the future of computational science in the UK, it's not just about lobbying the government for money, it's about ensuring that we have the community, the support in place, and the willingness to look for creative solutions to some of the problems that we're going to be facing. So, thanks very much.
Thank you, Alison. Do we have any questions?
So, Alison, I thought your point about what the general public would want a supercomputer to be for was really important. So what do you think the public would say if we asked them what we should use the supercomputer for? And would it be the same as what we would actually use it for if it was awarded?
I think, good question. I think that probably health-related issues are the ones that resonate most with the population. I can remember when I was at EPCC, when, I don't know if it was this computer or the one before, the Met Office got all this funding. There was some big headline which was, you know, Met Office gets big computer that's going to tell us what days to eat ice cream on. So I think you have to never underestimate the ability of the tabloids to take whatever you do and twist it. But yeah, I think we have to pick the use cases carefully. As I say, a huge number of people will benefit from the technology being put in place. But if, you know, you have to look at the difference between selling it to people and benefiting a much wider range of people. Probably, I think, from industry, that, you know, a number of engineering activities, materials, again, these are things that I think people can, that resonate with people. But I think for selling it to the general public, we want to make it as generic as possible. Although I will say everybody loves a cosmology picture and simulation.
Any other questions for Alison?
I was just going to make a quick comment, but interestingly, with medical science and research, oh, shall I have the mic? Wait for the mic. Wait for the mic, sorry.
It's coming.
I was just going to make a quick comment on medical research, because actually there's a sort of interesting split that occurs between medical research potentially and other fields, because actually there's a VAT exemption, and I don't know whether that puts pressure to have separate medical systems so that can be exempt from VAT, and you therefore would get more equipment, relatively speaking, and then maybe having the rest which would have to pay VAT on a different system. Any thoughts on that? Because it's a bit artificial.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, the UK pays VAT on the equipment we buy so that we can open it to as wide a section of people as possible. I know that, I think in the past there have been some universities which have bought equipment without VAT, but it does place restrictions on how you use it.
You can't
So,
use it for anything else at all apart from medical then.
yes. But we're a government UKRI is a government organisation. We pay our taxes.
Any others? All right. Thank you so much, Alison Kennedy.